Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. So welcome to the Environmental Research Seminar webinar. So I am Kyun Park, faculty member in Epidemiology and Environmental Health Sciences Department. So this seminar series is sponsored by the Michigan Life Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease Center, M-LEEaD. So these days, fall and very chilly outside, and now I can see the fall color. So hope everyone enjoy the fall season and stay warm and healthy during this chilly season. So we have special speakers today, Jiaxin Wu and Rachael Brooks. So both Jiaxin and Rachael are currently doctoral student in the Department of Epidemiology here at University of Michigan. So they are currently examining the roles of endocrine-disrupting chemicals in women's health, especially midlife women who are transitioning toward menopause. They focus on vasomotor symptoms that most women experience during the menopausal transition, but not much explored in relation to environmental exposure. So without further ado, so please join me in welcoming Jiaxin and Rachael.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Park, and thank you for everyone that joining us in today's talk. Today we will talk about our current work on endocrine-disrupting chemicals and vasomotor symptoms among midlife women using the data from SWAN. Okay, so we will divide in today's presentation into 6 sections, starting from the overview of vasomotor symptoms and endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and then moving on to the methods, PFAS results, and phthalates results, and then final the discussion section. So if you have any questions, it will be greatly appreciated if you could type them or save them to the very end, and we will discuss them together in the QA session. Starting from the overview of vasomotor symptoms, they are commonly known as hot flashes and night sweats. They are the common menopausal symptoms that women will seek treatment during the menopausal transition most often, and they are a form of temperature dysfunction that occur due to the changes in reproductive hormones. Previous literature has shown that up to 80% the peri and also postmenopausal women reported ever having experienced hot flash and night sweats. And currently, the major clinical treatment is still the hormone therapy. So the precise mechanism of VMS is still unclear, but there are several hypotheses around why VMS would occur during menopausal transition, mainly focusing on these 3 parts. The first is core body temperature dysregulation. The second is neurochemical imbalance, and the third one is peripheral vasculature changes. So I want to note is that these 3 hypotheses, they work simultaneously and they correlate with each other. They do not function like separately. So looking at the first one, the core body temperature dysfunction, it is related to the core body temperature change within this threshold that defined by upper threshold and lower threshold. On the left figure, this is a normal situation of how our core body temperature is regulated within this zone. But during VMS, we could see that the upper threshold gets lower and lower threshold gets upper. So this thermal neutral zone will get narrower. So although our core body temperature is still within this range, it's above the threshold right now. So we will get the symptoms like hot flash. And this hypothesis has been confirmed by several experimental studies. The second hypothesis is that there is potential neurochemical imbalance in brain, specifically the thermoregulatory center in hypothalamus, that is caused mainly by the fluctuation of estrogen during menopausal transition. Specifically, the estrogen level would decrease during menopausal transition, and there should have been a balance between estrogen level and neurokinin B. But because the decrease in estrogen level, there will be more neurokinin B activation to KND neurons. So this extra activation of KND neurons will lead to His dispersion and effectors, and will lead to symptoms like VMS. This hypothesis has also been confirmed, validated, and a new drug that is actually not hormonal related has been approved by FDA in 2023. Is focusing the neurokinin B to KNDY neuron activation process. So by blocking this pathway, this new drug can successfully treat vasomotor symptoms. The third mechanism is related to the peripheral vascular changes. It is related to the loss of responsiveness of peripheral vasculature. It is mainly the estrogen and progesterone. These two hormones activate and play a role in this mechanism. So VMS has been known to be related to multiple aspects of midlife women's health, including disrupting their sleep quality and duration. And VMS is also associated with increased cardiovascular risk. It is related to impaired cognition performance, mood change, and increase the risk for depressive symptoms. It will also be related to interrupt the daily activities and work productivity. Previously, literature also showed that VMS could result in extra financial burden, including both the direct health effect and indirect economic loss due to the missed work. So women cannot go to work because they have such VMS experiences. There have been several potential risk factors for VMS, including the genetic factors, obesity, the socioeconomic factors, health behaviors, including smoking, dietary intake, alcohol intake, and physical activity, and also negative mood, such as anxiety and perceived stress. And last but not the least, the environmental toxic exposure, such as endocrine-disrupting chemicals. So what are the endocrine-disrupting chemicals exactly? They are defined as the exogenous agents that interfere with the production, release, transport, metabolism, binding, action, or elimination of natural hormones in our body. On the right, these three figures show how actual normal hormone works within our cell, and also how hormone mimic and a hormone blocker could inhibit such normal process. So how EDC work is basically described in the second and the third figures. They could actually act as either hormone mimic or hormone blocker. So there are two broad groups of EDCs, including the synthetic EDCs and natural EDCs. Today, our presentation will mainly focus on the synthetic EDCs, including the PFAS and phthalates. There are multiple exposure sources of endocrine-disrupting chemicals, including food, water supply, air, dust, personal care products, household products, and occupational exposure. And there are several routes of exposure to EDC, including inhalation, ingestion, and dermal absorption. So for the two EDCs that we will focus today, PFAS mainly exposed through water, drinking water, and phthalates mainly through personal care products and plastics. So endocrine-disrupting chemicals has been found to be associated with several adverse health effects, including the neurobehavioral and neurodevelopmental changes, cardiometabolic disorders such as cardiovascular disease, and also obesity, type 2 diabetes. And EDCs are also known for their reproductive toxicity, and it could also lead to potential bone health impairment. For EDC exposure in the United States, it is estimated that the annual disease-related economic burden of exposure to EDC are up to over $300 billion. That is almost 2% of US GDP in 2010. Specifically looking at the female reproductive aging, the endocrine-disrupting chemicals has been found to negatively impact ovarian histology and morphology through the in vivo and in vitro studies, meaning that endocrine-disrupting chemicals could impair the overall function of ovarian cells and could disrupt the production of follicles and also hormones. And previous epidemiological studies also shown that exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals is associated with decreased estrogen, increased follicle stimulating hormone, and earlier onset of natural menopause. However, there is no previous literature directly looking at the association between exposure to EDC and vasomotor symptoms. So that lead to our research questions. Are individual and mixture of endocrine disrupting chemicals positively associated with VMS experience among midlife? In this presentation, we will focus on PFAS and phthalates.
In order to answer our research question, we're going to be using a large cohort that's housed in the United States. So participants from our study were selected from the study of women's health across the nation. SWAN is a multi-site, multi-ethnic cohort study that recruited around 3,300 women aged 42 to 52 from seven U.S. sites. These sites included Oakland, California, Los Angeles, California, Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, Southeast Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Boston, Massachusetts, and Newark, New Jersey. The eligibility criteria included self-identification as white, Black, Chinese, Japanese, or Hispanic, an intact uterus and at least one ovary and a recent menstrual period, and no recent use of reproductive hormones, since SWAN was designed to study women as they go through the menopausal transition. So the baseline for SWAN was in 1996 to 1997, and it had near annual follow-up for the next 20 years. But this study specifically, our study specifically, is utilizing a sub-study of SWAN, the SWAN multi-pollutant study, which assessed environmental chemical exposures using banked biospecimens. SWAN MPS used blood and urine samples that were collected from the still active participants at SWAN Visit 3, which happened in 1999 to 2000. Of those active women, 648 women were from sites that did not collect required samples, so Chicago and Newark, and the other women did not have sufficient blood, serum, or urine samples. These women were then excluded from SWAN MPS, so in total, SWAN MPS included 1,400 women. And because SWAN MPS excluded women from the Newark site, our study doesn't have Hispanic women in it. In order to be eligible for this specific study, women needed to have complete data for VMS experience as well as our selected covariates, and they were also excluded if they were pregnant or lactating. So based on these criteria, our analytical sample included roughly 1,300 women. So to measure PFAS, women provided serum blood samples that were collected at in-person clinical visits in 1999 and 2000. 11 serum PFAS measurements were collected, and of those 11, only the 7 PFAS with detection rates of above 95% were included in this study, and the others were excluded. We included one sum variable, which was total PFAS, which was created using branched PFAS and linear PFAS measurements. And then because the distribution of PFAS were highly skewed, we log2 transformed them. Similarly, to measure our phthalates, women provided spot urine samples, which were collected, again, at in-person clinical visits at the baseline. 12 individual urinary phthalate metabolites were measured, and we included 11 of our phthalates, so we did not include MINP because its detection rate was so low. We included 3 sum variables in our phthalate measurements, and these included low molecular weight phthalates, our DEHP phthalates, and high molecular weight phthalates. Like the PFAS measurements, phthalates were log2 transformed to make the distributions more normal. And then additionally, because these measurements came from urine, we further creatinine standardized and covariate adjusted, which is a method to correct for urine dilution. So VMS were assessed at follow-up visits using a standard questionnaire. During each visit, each woman answered 2 questions about the frequency of both their hot flashes and night sweats that they experienced in the past 2 weeks. Response options included none, 1 to 5 days, 6 to 8 days, 9 to 13 days, or every day for how often women experienced VMS. And then because the outcome for this study was VMS experience, we categorized hot flashes and night sweats together and made a binary variable of either no VMS, so neither hot flashes nor night sweats in the past 2 weeks, or any VMS experience, so having any hot flashes or night sweats in the past 2 weeks. The covariates for our study were collected at one of 2 time points. We had covariates that we selected at the SWAN baseline, and that included site, race, ethnicity, and education, and they were collected using questionnaires. We also collected premenstrual symptoms, and we calculated it using 4 variables: abdominal cramps, breast tenderness, bloating, and mood changes. These measurements were used to create a categorical variable with options of either no symptoms, 1 to 2 symptoms, or 3 to 4 symptoms, and we categorized prior anxiety as either any anxiety or no anxiety. All of our other covariates were measured at the SWAN MPS baseline in 1999 or 2000. These included symptom sensitivity measurements, which were a sum score of degree of awareness of loud noises, hot or cold, hunger, pain, or things happening in one's body, with response options that range from not at all true to extremely true. We also measured physical activity using an index that summarizes the frequency and intensity of leisure time, physical activity, housework, and active transport, with scores that ranged from 3 to 15, and it was treated as continuous in our analysis. We also treated body mass index as continuous. We collected smoking status information using surveys with response options for smoking status of never, past, and current, as well as we collected information on passive smoking status with options of either none or any. We also measured menopausal status, and it was determined based on self-report of menstrual bleeding frequency, history of gynecologic surgeries, and use of exogenous hormones using questionnaires. So looking at all of that, we have our baseline characteristics of the SWAN MPS population. About 50% of our population was white, 22% Black, and 28% Asian, which is a sum category of both Chinese and Japanese. Our mean age was roughly 49.5, and between 17 and 26% of women came from each of our included 5 study locations. Something important to note is the fact that we had 70% of women at visit 3 either experiencing VMS at that experience or have experienced it prior. So this is a really high proportion of our study sample that had prevalent VMS. And then 12% of our population was premenopausal and 59% was perimenopausal. And because the prevalence of VMS was so high in this study, we didn't want to lose those cases by fitting a traditional Cox proportional hazards model that would that would remove the prevalent cases from the beginning of the study. Instead, we used accelerated failure time models, or AFTs, to evaluate these associations. So a key strength of the AFT models is the ability to accommodate interval censoring, which occurs when the exact time of the event onset isn't exactly known, but we know that it falls within a range of specific ages. To do AFT models, there's different types of censoring that we specify. So we first have right censoring, which is women who did not experience VMS during follow-up, meaning that their event time is treated as unknown because it exceeds their last observed age. And then we have observed cases where women who experienced VMS during the study, whether their event time happens when VMS occurs. And then women who had already experienced VMS baseline are not excluded in AFT models. Instead, they're classified as left censored with their VMS onset assumed to have occurred sometime between a defined risk window. For this study, we chose age 40 as this risk time period where VMS could develop, and then their baseline interview age. Doing this can reduce bias from excluding prevalent cases. Additionally, AFT models directly estimate time, which gives us a time ratio instead of a hazard ratio. However, in certain cases, this time ratio can be converted to hazard ratios, depending on the distribution that we select to fit the AFT models. Additionally, to examine differences in risk of VMS between subgroups of different exposure patterns to EDC mixtures, we used k-means clustering. K-means clustering is an unsupervised machine learning algorithm that partitions individuals into pre-specified numbers of clusters based on similarity in their exposure profiles. So to do this, first, individual EDCs are standardized to make the variables comparable. Second, a number of centroids is picked, and then points are iteratively assigned to the nearest centroid, and then that centroid is recalculated. This is repeated until the centroids no longer change, or the maximum number of iterations is reached, where we have clusters at the end, and that represents different mixture patterns. The number of centroids is selected using the elbow method, which is a visual technique for finding the optimal number of centroids, or the K in k-means clustering. It works by running k-means for a range of these values, plotting the within cluster sum of squares against each k, and then the elbow point on the graph was where it bends, and the within cluster sum of squares stops decreasing rapidly, and then we choose that as the optimal k and the number of clusters that we specify for the k-means clustering algorithm. Doing this lets us see mixtures of different individual EDCs, and then after our k-means clustering identifies our specific clusters, we can refit our AFT models using those clusters to see differences between different exposure patterns of mixtures of total EDCs, which is very exciting. Additionally, we considered several inverse probability weights, or IPWs, in this study. So first, we considered potential left truncation bias. Left truncation occurs when participants who have already experienced an event of interest prior to enrollment are excluded from the study population. So specifically in the context of SWAN, our analytical sample comes from participants who were eligible for longitudinal SWAN cohort, which followed a prior cross-sectional screening that happened from 1995 to 1997. This introduces the possibility that women who were included in longitudinal SWAN may have been systematically different than those initially screened. So to mitigate this bias, IPWs were constructed to reweight the sample to represent the full population of screened women. Second, selection bias was also considered due to the study only including women who were enrolled in SWAN MPS and not just SWAN longitudinal. If selection into SWAN MPS was associated both with EDC levels and with VMS, then estimates may be biased. So because of this, a second set of IPWs was created to account for the conditional probability of being selected into SWAN MPS. A joint IPW, which includes both the weights to address left truncation as well as selection, was generated to address multiple sources of bias. The estimates were compared between different IPW methods to determine which weights should be included for each analysis.
Okay, so moving on to our results, starting from the results for PFAS. We first identify the individual effect of each PFAS compound using the weighted interval-censored AFT models, and we identified that all of the individual PFAS has time ratio smaller than 1, meaning that they are associated with earlier VMS onset. However, the PFNA and branched PFOS, they are not statistically significant, and linear PFOA has the largest effect size on VMS onset. And then for the mixture effect, we used the k-means cluster analysis. First, we used the elbow plot to show that cluster 3, k equals to 3 is the optimal setting. So we define the number of clusters as 3, and then we use a k-means cluster analysis, identify 3 clusters that are for our cluster 1. They are the participants who have a PFAS exposure level around average level, and cluster 2 are the participants has exposure level over average, and cluster 3 is exposure level smaller than average. To be clear, the average value here is the sample average in our study sample. It's not representable of national average of PFAS exposure. So because the cluster 3 is a group that has exposure level, lower exposure level, so we use cluster 3 as a reference group. And then compared to cluster 3, cluster 1 has time ratio of 0.91 that is statistically significant, meaning that exposure to higher PFAS levels are associated with earlier onset of VMS. Although cluster 2 is not statistically significant, but we think it's marginal statistically significant. But the magnitude of time ratio is smaller than the first time ratio, meaning it's closer to the null. So we think that there could be potential non-linear dose response relationship between individual PFAS exposure, mixture of PFAS exposure to VMS onset.
So when looking at the results between phthalates and VMS, we converted the time ratios to hazard ratios because this AFT was fit using the Weibull model, and it was the best fit when comparing the optimal final log likelihoods. So for hazard ratios, it's the opposite of time ratios, where an estimate greater than 1 indicates earlier onset of VMS. So in our results, we found that some individual phthalates were consistently associated with a higher incidence of VMS over the total follow-up period, primarily when looking at the overall associations. The DEHP phthalate metabolites, both individual and some DEHP, as well as MIBP and some high molecular weight phthalates were associated with VMS. These associations did differ between racial and ethnic groups, however, with white and Asian women, like the overall associations, experiencing higher risk from DEHP phthalates, both individual and some DEHP. But interestingly, when looking at the results among Black women, these women experienced higher risk from lower molecular weight phthalates, specifically MEP, MIBP, and some low molecular weight phthalates. These differences might reflect variation in primary exposure routes across different populations of women. Like we mentioned earlier, phthalates are widely used as plasticizers and solvents in a variety of consumer goods, such as personal care products and food packaging. And low molecular weight phthalates commonly come from personal care products like hair care, fragrances, and cosmetics, while DEHP and high molecular weight phthalates are linked to the dietary exposures through food packaging. And prior research has documented racial and ethnic differences both in product use and in concentrations of phthalates, with Black women in particular experiencing consistently higher exposures to personal care-related products where the lower molecular weight phthalates are found than both white and Asian women. This finding was reflected in our study, with Black women having significantly higher exposure to low molecular weight phthalates. And these differences in exposure patterns might partly explain the different associations that we saw, but we're going to dig into that a little bit further in future directions. When looking at mixtures, it's important because we're able to better capture these real-world exposure patterns and look at combined effects of exposures to phthalates. Individuals are rarely exposed to just single phthalates in isolation. Instead, they're more likely to encounter combinations from everyday sources of exposure. And the K-means clustering approach revealed 3 clusters of women with distinct exposure profiles, which suggests different exposures to mixtures of phthalates in the environment. Our clusters for phthalates weren't quite as clean-cut as the ones for PFAS, with, like Jiaxin said, with low, average, and higher than average exposures. Instead, each of our exposure patterns for phthalates showed kind of different exposure routes. So cluster 1 represented women with generally low exposure across all phthalates. Cluster 2 was characterized by a higher concentration of all lower molecular weight phthalates and 1 high molecular weight phthalate, MBZP. The clustering of this high molecular weight phthalate with the low molecular weight phthalates was a little bit unexpected, but other observational evidence has suggested PVC fluoring as a potential exposure route between the two, and this shared exposure may help to explain the clustering of the low molecular weight phthalate and the high molecular weight phthalates. And then our third cluster was women with very elevated concentrations of DEHP metabolites and a higher concentration of the other high molecular weight phthalates. So these patterns suggest that women's exposure profiles aren't really random, but might instead reflect underlying environmental determinants that can contribute to phthalate levels. So like we saw in the individual effects for phthalates, when we fit our AFT models with clusters identified by k-means, we saw similar associations with the highest risk of VMS coming from the cluster that has the DEHP phthalate exposure. So when we're looking at our findings, we found that our AFT models identified significant individual effects. So both higher exposure to individual EDCs were associated with earlier onset of VMS in midlife women. And then in phthalates, where we stratified by racial and ethnic groups, we saw associations varying across those racial and ethnic groups significantly. And then when we looked at our mixtures effects, we saw both distinct mixtures and distinct effects. So for PFAS, comparing to the below average mixture exposure groups, individuals with above average PFAS exposure levels had a significantly earlier onset of VMS. And then similarly for phthalates, individuals with higher DEHP exposure had non-significantly earlier VMS, but still earlier. Our studies have several strengths. First, like Jiaxin mentioned earlier, to our knowledge, this is the first study to evaluate longitudinal associations between PFAS specifically and VMS. Additionally, when looking at phthalates, it's only the second longitudinal study to examine phthalates in relation to VMS, and the first to do so in a large racially and ethnically diverse cohort that's more representative of midlife women in the entire United States. The large sample size of SWAN enhances the generalizability of our findings and also allowed us to look at associations within 3 racial and ethnic groups, which revealed important differences between the 3 groups. Further, we employed the use of AFT models, which provided a direct estimation of survival time and may have better captured the timing of VMS as compared to Cox proportional hazard models, because our prevalent cases were not excluded. We additionally used multiple sets of IPWs to account for potential selection bias and left truncation. However, our studies do have several limitations that we wanted to mention. The first relates to exposure assessment, specifically for phthalates. Phthalates are what we call non-persistent pollutants, meaning that they have a relatively short biological half-life, and our exposure measurement was based on 1 spot urine sample collected at the baseline in 1999 to 2000. Although this is a really common way of measuring phthalates, they are short-lived in the body and exposure can be variable. So this method may not have captured long-term or habitual exposure, and using only 1 spot urine sample may not have captured that variation in exposure that we would expect to see. So measurement error is a concern. For PFAS, even though they're considered to be persistent pollutants, a single measurement of PFAS at baseline might not be sufficient to represent overall PFAS exposure through the entire follow-up period. And then further, despite adjusting for a number of covariates, as with all observational studies, there is the possibility of residual confounding, particularly with respect to other environmental chemicals, as it's unlikely that individuals are only exposed to one endocrine-disrupting chemical at a time.
So with the acknowledgement of all those limitations, we still got more work to do. So here are the future directions of our study. First, in this current analysis, we're only examining the VMS incidence, which meaning the time of women first report having VMS. So we will examine more aspects of VMS in the future, including the frequency, the duration, and the trajectories of VMS over menopausal transition. And secondly, we will explore the effects of other EDCs that has been measured in the SWAN MPS study, including the heavy metals, phenols, and dialkyl phosphates. And we will also consider a mixture of EDCs of using other statistical approaches due to the likelihood of co-exposures. Because in this analysis, we use k-means clustering analysis. It identified the mixture of EDCs by categorize the mixture of endocrine-disrupting chemicals into different clusters. And we're also looking to our analytic approaches in the future. And we will also consider the exposure race ethnicity interaction, as we observe that significant difference across different racial ethnic groups regarding the phthalates and VMS. And instead of using baseline covariates, we will consider also using the time-varying covariates in future analysis, especially considering the menopausal status in our data sample. And we think that menopausal status may significantly impact women's VMS experiences. So maybe using the time-varying covariates could help us capture a more non-biased association. Yeah, and then we want to have our big acknowledgement for the generous funding from multiple agencies, and with all the hardworking people from multi-pollutant epidemiology group, and also investigators, administrative staff, and most importantly, all the participants for the study of women's health across the nation. And that's it. Thank you. Looking forward to discussing more in the Q&A session.
Great. Yeah, this is very interesting, and I like your this cartoon in this last slide. And
yeah, it's like a younger generation talking to the midlife women, and yeah, improving women's health overall. That's our optimal goal. Yeah.
Yeah. It's great. Okay. All right. So we have two questions right now, but for those who stay in this talk and have any question, please use the Q&A menu on the bottom, and then please enter your question, and so we will cover your question. So, and Jiaxin and Rachel, so you can also see this one, the question, but I will read the question and then you can answer to that. So the question from Dr. Devon Payne Sturge. So it is great talk. So have you all considered replicating your study using NHANES, and maybe not only NHANES but also so what other study can be used to replicate this finding?
Yeah, it is a great point. Yeah, I have presented this idea at SER, and there is another group also working on this. They're actually the group who published the first longitudinal study using the phthalates and VMS experiences, and we think not necessarily replicating, but maybe we can compare our results to theirs and see how the results are different or the same. And speaking of NHANES, we did think about using that study before, but we look into about how NHANES collect data on VMS experiences. We don't find much helpful information on that specifically. So unfortunately, we don't think NHANES could be a good data source for replicating our study or examining more our study research question. But we are always open and looking forward to collaborate or work together with others to see whether we could use other data sets to also work on this research topic, because there's really no study has done this before, so we're looking forward to that.
I think another important point is starting follow-up earlier instead of starting follow-up where women have already started transitioning into menopause, but starting it before the risk period even starts, so we wouldn't have the problem of all of these prevalent cases at the beginning. So designing studies intentionally, or using studies that were designed for something else but are now turning into studies of aging in midlife women, to start collecting data a little bit earlier so we don't have to do all the tricky statistical things.
Maybe so for those who joined this the talk a little late, and so can you give us how VMS or a specific menopausal symptom will measure in SWAN?
Yeah, SWAN measured vasomotor symptoms using questionnaires based on two questions, have you experienced a hot flash in the past 2 weeks? And have you experienced a night sweats in the past 2 weeks? And if you have, you need to choose how many times. We can go back to that slides, maybe.
All the way back.
Yes.
based on the 2 weeks period
Yes,
from the interview and then whether or not they experience VMS.
yes. It's self-reported, and it's only based on it only asking about previous 2-week experiences. So it's not like completely like we have to admit that there's potential misclassification error and potential information bias in this VMS measurement.
What about the premenstrual symptoms and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So the another question again from Dr. Devon Payne-Sturge is that how should we interpret your results regarding phthalate when exposure to the phthalate DHP have really decreased in recent decades due to regulation and changes in product manufacturing?
Yeah, that's a big problem, especially with phthalates, considering how fast they're metabolized through the body. And that one of the things that we talked about was trying to do time-varying covariates. We also have 2 time points where we measured phthalates in SWAN. And so once we are able to address time-varying like confounding, we are also going to be able to have repeated measures of phthalates, which will be a stronger argument for phthalates, considering we'll have 2 time points where they were measured. But the issue is with phthalates, even though certain exposures can go down, there's replacements that might come in where other exposures might go up. So looking at phthalates as a whole rather than just individuals might be like an area of particular note moving forward.
Yeah. Maybe I can add a little bit more to this talk. And so there's a recent study showing that, we know that DHP have been replaced with other, the phthalate compound. And in the US population, when DHP, using the biomonitoring, the DHP concentration decline, but at the same time, the other chemical, exposure level increase. So that's why the probably total, this phthalate or any, the pesticide exposure level have not changed over the decade. And there is a question about whether or not different types of chemical have a different, reproductive toxicity or not. But that is an important research, future direction that we need to address. All right, so another question you can also see this from the chat. So thank you for this excellent talk on an important topic. So vasomotor symptom can be linked to CVD risk factors and outcome. Do you have any plans to follow the participant long-term for CVD or other outcomes?
Yeah, that is another very exciting area, and I think there are other groups working for SWAN data already did this type of analysis. I think it's from Dr. Rebecca Thurston's team. They already look at experienced VMS, categorize them the VMS frequency and link to cardiovascular disease risk using the SWAN data, and they already have some significant findings. That's very exciting. And in the future, I think that is definitely another exciting area to work on. And also not only the vasomotor symptoms, but also the hormone therapy. That is a major current clinical treatment used for vasomotor symptoms. May or may not also have some association and effect on the cardiovascular disease risk. So it would also be interesting and exciting to work on that area. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I want to reformulate this question, and I think this is really important question. So, if most women, experience this vasomotor symptoms, so hot flash and night sweat, so timing matters.
Yeah.
So that's why the point is So in this population, so even though the proportion is small, but there should be some group of women who never experience VMS.
Yes, correct.
So that's why who they are. So what specific characteristic they have, and gene play the most important role, or is it really the environmental the exposure, and that's why how much the chemical exposure play a role in terms of this experiencing VMS during the menopausal transition?
I think that is a great future direction point. We need to go back and look at our data regarding that specific. But based on our previous analysis, I think less than 100 women who are never experienced VMS across the whole SWAN follow-up so far. So we definitely need to go back to our data and look at what are there specific characteristics that are different from the rest of our study participants? Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I can add additional questions. So for those who will be watching, this, the webinar in the future, so maybe you also want to give them some information about, so how can we prevent VMS if chemical exposure really play a role? And so do you have any recommendation to reduce the risk for having this VMS experience?
Well, for PFAS, I think there is not quite some strategy to eliminate the PFAS, because the major elimination pathway for PFAS is menstrual bleeding and breastfeeding. For midlife women, unfortunately, these two elimination pathway doesn't exist anymore. But blood donation could be another way to eliminate PFAS exposure. And so from another aspect, of course, avoid to exposure to those chemicals would be very important to not get exposed to those chemicals. And for phthalates, I think
in some ways it might be a little bit easier because they are metabolized in the body very quickly. And so it's really the repeated use of products that contain phthalates in them that leads to this consistent exposure to it. So it might be easier to change personal habits. So the way that the food products that you consume, as well as the personal care products that you use. So I know after I did this research, I went home and I looked at my shampoo and conditioner bottles and double checked what was contained in my products. So that's a more modifiable factor that might be a little bit easier to address than a more persistent exposure like PFAS.
Yeah. We saw another question.
So the question, so this is the question that is very related to I just asked you and you already answered, but if you have any additional recommendation, you can do that. So building on the last question, would you recommend that women experience hot flash to reduce their use of plastics? And do you think that would help resolve the symptoms?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay. And then we saw another question.
Another question. So I'm curious if you could speak to the effect size of EDC on VMS onset compared to other lifestyle dietary factors.
Yeah, we think that is a great point, and we are currently working on that, comparing the effects of EDCs on VMS onset to the smoking effect on VMS onset. And we are really excited and looking forward to see our results on that. And we will keep updated, if we get more. Yeah.
Okay, and then so we have I think this is a comment, Mary Ambergy, about the checkout. Actually, I'm not familiar with this one, but Yuka app, YUKA app. I don't know if all the attendee can see this comment, but it's great for scanning barcodes and gives you alternative products if the one you scan is dangerous. It sounds like this Yuka app provide information about the chemical in the product. And so if after you scan this, okay, so after scanning the product, and then you can find alternative, more environment-friendly product. And probably that could be a good option for them. Okay, all right. No cost for the.
Really interesting. That'd be a really
Thank you for the info, Mary.
cool way of monitoring what products you use.
Yeah.
Okay, so now this is 12:50, so we need to wrap up this webinar. And so the Jiaxin and Rachael, they are currently the PhD students. I want to tell you, you did a great job. So, and I'm pretty sure that everyone enjoy your talk. And so we will continue to have this opportunity and invite the doctoral student and other trainees, so including postdoc, to present and then share their study through this environmental research seminar. So please stay with us, and then we will find out very interesting study that is done in here, University of Michigan. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. So I'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.